Hello, everyone, and welcome to a conversation on recovering Republican virtue in a fractured age. I'm Adam White, a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's conversation, which is co-organized by the Claremont McKenna College's Henry Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World. We often think of the American Constitution in terms of its separation of powers, its checks and balances. As James Madison famously explained, our constitutional structure allows ambition to counteract ambition so that we don't need to count on our leaders or ourselves to always be angels. But Madison also emphasized that Republican government does rely on certain virtues, certain marks of character in order to work. And that's the focus of today's conversation. I'm keen to hear from our speakers, so let me turn it over to them now. Each of them will offer some opening remarks, and rather than introduce them all at once, I'll introduce them when it's each's turn to speak. And we'll begin with George Thomas. He directs the Salvatori Center, and he's a professor of government here at the Claremont McKenna College, where he writes on American political institutions. His latest book is The Founders and the Idea of a National University, and his next book on America's Unwritten Constitution is forthcoming. George, welcome. I guess the opening question for you and for everybody is pretty general. What is Republican virtue? What is civic virtue? And how should we understand it in American government and American society?
Okay, well, let me just begin. I'll try to keep it really brief up front and then engage in a conversation as we go. But I just want to begin thanking Adam first, and then also Nicole Penn from AEI. They've been, instrumental in bringing this together, which I believe, as Adam reminds me, was supposed to occur, or was planned to occur last March in DC, which would have been pre-COVID, or I suppose we were planning it as COVID was happening and we didn't know about it. But so let me begin just by observing that Americans, by and large, take democracy and our political institutions for granted. We tend to think, in James Russell Lowe's famous phrase, that the Constitution is a machine that would go up itself. What we forget is that Lowell himself gave this speech in rejecting this idea. It was a speech actually aimed at reminding us of our political duties, and that America's experiment of democracy, as Lowell called it, needed to be carried forward by the current generation. So if nothing else, recent events, especially January 6th, are a vivid reminder that America is not immune to democratic decay. In fact, I want to suggest that the last 5 years or so have been a reminder that our political institutions depend on a modicum of Republican or civic virtue. Now, we tend to think, as Adam set out at the beginning, in terms of the separation of powers and checks and balances, and famously Madison said in Federalist 10, that we can't create government presuming that statesmen will always be at the helm, because they won't. What's also less overlooked, though, is for as much as we focus on this institutional design, Madison was also deeply interested in how leaders would be cultivated. So, what we tend to forget that in Federalist 57, Madison wrote, "The aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers of men who possess the most wisdom to discern, the most virtue to pursue, the common good of society. And in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous while they continue to hold their public trust." And so we tend to put this second part first. But in Federalist 57, Madison puts this idea of some kind of public leadership up front. So one of the things I hope that we will discuss here is, how do we go about cultivating that kind of public leadership, which is often called a kind of civic virtue or Republican virtue. Now, there are a couple of ways I think we can think about this, and I think both Stephen and Colleen and well, Jonathan as well will speak to this in more detail. And part of it is when we think of our media environment today, our political parties today, our educational institutions today, those are all things that tend to generate a particular kind of culture and a particular kind of leadership and understandings, and how have those changed dramatically, and what can we do about those. But I want to begin by saying, when we think of Republican virtue in the American scheme, we're not talking anything like a total devotion to public affairs or to civic life. It's far more modest. It's much more modest in its recognition that the public good is different from your immediate interests and policy preferences, and that any effort to construct the public good requires working with those you disagree with and acknowledging them as your fellow citizens, and that you're willing to compromise with them to achieve something greater than your immediate interests or your immediate policy goals. So I want to set that out as an initial sketch of the kind of Republican virtue we're looking for. It's indeed, I think, quite modest, and it really recognizes not just kind of compromise and moderation, but a sense that the public good is greater than your immediate self-interest, and that it's something that needs to be constructed with your fellow citizens, whom you're going to disagree with intensely. And I know there's a lot of reason to be dispirited and concerned, but I wanted to begin this session on an optimistic note, which I think also gives an example of a kind of civic virtue or Republican virtue in action in the last few years. And I think that while our own time is deeply divided, it's also, for those on the center left and center right, reaffirmed Thomas Jefferson's famous saying that not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. In fact, worried about the future of American democracy, wide swaths of the center left and center right have really worked together to reaffirm democratic principles and institutions. They've worked together to understand what they have in common, and that what they have in common is in fact greater than what separates them. They've realized that the principles, norms, and practices of liberal democracy, as embraced by the American Constitution, are much more important than their short-term policy concerns. And they've realized how important it is to work with those they disagree with, and that they're going to inhabit the same political space with those they disagree with, or even sharing something deeper in common. So, I think, and I'm thinking especially of Republicans who rejected some in their party for engaging in lies and misinformation, for breaking democratic norms, threatening democratic institutions, and worked to help elect moderate Democrats. I'm also thinking about wide swaths of the center left, both in the intellectual world, but also in the political world, that really then went out of their way to work with them as well. And I'll give one example that you didn't see 4 or 5 years ago. You see somebody like William Salatin at Slate being a frequent guest on somebody like Charlie Sykes' podcast, where they're really trying to find common ground. I mean, I think that's one small example, but that's the kind of that's the kind of action I think that could give us real reason for hope in our increasingly fractured world. But then let me throw out and end on this note just a kind of quick question in thinking about our current situation, because I think for as much as we've spoken of our political institutions recently, and we've been very worried about institutional failure, and I think there's reason to be preoccupied with that, I think a lot of the recent failures are really failures of public leadership. And so one of the things I really hope that the other panelists will address and that we can engage in is, how do we then cultivate this sense of a public-spirited leadership? Because this is something that the Constitution and our political institutions require, but they themselves do not speak to in any real clear way. So I'll end on that note as a beginning.
Thanks, George. You've laid out a lot for all of us to consider. I don't want to forget to remind our audience that we welcome questions. If you'd like to submit a question throughout today's conversation, you can do it in 2 ways. You can do it on Twitter, a very civic-minded institution, right? But you can do it on Twitter at hashtag AEI AEI Virtue. That's hashtag AEI Virtue. Or you can send them by email to Nicole Penn, our colleague here at AEI. Our email address is nicole.penn@aei.org. That's Nicole without an H, Penn with 2 N's, nicole.penn@aei.org. Our next guest today is Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where he writes on public policy and American culture. His next book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, is due for release in June. And in case Jonathan doesn't point out himself, it's available for pre-ordering on Amazon and all their fine booksellers. I'd add also that Jonathan's new article, or his article in the new issue of National Affairs, is focused on the war on professionalism in public life. And so, Jonathan, with you too, I'd begin with the same general question. How do you go about thinking about Republican virtue in our government and our life, and what do you focus on specifically?
Well, thank you, Adam. I feel like I'm a bit of an interloper on this extremely distinguished panel. Not only do I not have a PhD and I'm not a specialist in virtue, I'm a journalist by training. And my experience in Washington and politics has been largely practical in many ways. So I feel privileged to be here, a bit overmatched by the subject. When I think about civic virtue or Republican virtue, which I'll use interchangeably for purposes of my brief comments, I think about that not in terms of sort of the modern Christian notion of positive personal qualities, but in the Aristotelian sense, which I think is more like what the founders intended, which is that virtues are practices and habits that aid in human flourishing, both as individuals and in societies. They're things we do not necessarily thinking about it every day, but on which we all depend. They're things that you can't easily legislate, but that you can inculcate and that are very, very important. The founders said again and again, as we all know, and most of them said, Adams, Madison, Jefferson, Franklin, at one point or another, they all emphasized the key to keeping a republic. Nothing else will work. No parchment barriers, as Madison put it, will defend the republic if you don't have a sufficient base of Republican virtue. And they knew what they were talking about. They knew that republics had fallen again and again throughout history because the public was not capable of sustaining the virtues, the habits, norms, and practices of republicanism. So we can all make our list of what those virtues are and what they look like. It's very important to do that. I'd like to mention three today that I think are both important and under some degree of significant worrisome pressure. They're not the only ones, and I may not even be defining them correctly. But I'll name them because I think there are reasons to be concerned. The first is civility. We often think of civility as politeness and courtesy, and of course it can be politeness and courtesy, but it means at a more fundamental level, sharing the country with people that you profoundly disagree with and treating them like human beings, accepting the legitimacy that they too are here, that they too enjoy the same rights that you do. And that's a surprisingly hard thing to do. It's a kind of deeper form of respect than just making respectful gestures in speech. It requires a real understanding that I might be wrong for all my certainty and all my belief, and the other person might actually be right. There's an element of doubt in real civility, as well as an element of decency, of treatment, lines that you don't cross in how you deal with other people. A second is forbearance. This is one we don't talk about nearly enough. Democracy depends on the idea that we don't try to annihilate the enemy. In fact, that the other side isn't the enemy. The other side may be an antagonist from time to time, an opponent from time to time, but we don't try to wipe them off the map. We never try to win for good. And when we come to power, we understand that the wheel will turn, that they may come to power as well. And so we're very careful about preserving norms and institutions that will protect all of us. And that requires forbearance, especially if one party controls both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. Forbearance is just extremely important in making democracy work, because without it, of course, one party assumes that if it loses the next election, everything's over. And this is the meme of the so-called Flight 93 election that we've heard so much about. The other side wins the next election, is the end of democracy as we know it. The third of these Republican virtues that are so important is truthfulness. There is no law that enforces truthfulness outside of specific contexts like, securities fraud and testimony under oath. But for the most part, the founders understood that without a certain amount of integrity in what people say and the information they give, democracy will not long survive. Politicians need to understand that the norm is, in fact, being truthful. Of course, they will shade the truth, they will spin, sometimes they need to lie. but they don't routinely lie, and we hold them to account when they do. You can't have democracy without those three things. And I'd argue that all three of them are under a certain amount of very serious pressure. The first, civility, is at risk from outrage culture. And that's particularly online, but not only online. It turns out that outrage has a very good business model. It's sticky, it's addictive, it's very hard to terrorize off of. It's great to sell advertising against. It's easy to monetize and extremely easy to do. We see this online every day. We now see it in politics every day, much more than when I was a kid. The second is forbearance. We often talk about polarization as a big problem in American political life, and it is, but the founders did not expect people to agree. They did not expect people to be moderates. They expected clashes of very strong disagreements. Forbearance allows the country to survive those disagreements by saying, okay, maybe I lose this time, but maybe I win next time. In extreme polarization, we're seeing much less of that. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing much more of the Flight 93 election notion. If I lose this time, it's curtains for good. That makes it extremely difficult to compromise, to do business, to show respect for the other side. You come to hate them. You come to fear them. You think they're a threat, an endangerment. The third and most important, truthfulness. Here, what we've seen, we had a joke before the session started about how long we'd be able to go without saying the word Trump. So here it goes. What we've seen in the last 4 years, time before that, but especially the last 4 years, has been the adoption in American politics of Russian-style disinformation tactics. This is called the fire herd of falsehood. It's a propaganda tactic that just floods the airways with lies, so that it becomes very difficult for people to stay oriented, trust anyone, know what's true and what's false. This is a very effective propaganda tactic. It is old, it is well understood, and it works. We're now seeing it in American politics. We've seen it from Trump. I believe it's going to be further adapted by other players, and that also, I believe, is a problem. So those are some notions about civic virtue and about some problems that they face.
Thanks, Jonathan. Our next speaker is Colleen Sheehan. She's Director of Graduate Studies at the Arizona State School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Her books include The Mind of James Madison, The Legacy of Classical Republicanism in 2015, and James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government in 2009. Colleen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Nicole, as well, and AEI for having me. Maybe I can fill in a little bit of the historical background here to put this in context, and you'll probably hear me mention Madison once or twice. So it's generally thought by scholars that there's a fundamental difference between modern and ancient republicanism. Ancient republics, as George mentioned, took their bearings from the virtue of the citizens who devoted their lives to the commonweal, who actively participated in lawmaking, and who would willingly put their lives on the line for the good of their fatherland. In contrast, modern republicanism is generally thought to be tantamount to liberalism. That is, includes individualism, acquisitiveness, commercialism, and it's spurred not by the love of one's polity, but by the pursuit of self-interest in, at best, a pluralistic kind of environment. So where does America fit into these very different conceptions of Republican government? Most scholars claim that the United States is and was envisioned to be a modern liberal commercial republic. That's still probably the dominant interpretation. So this includes authors such as Martin Diamond, Tom Pangle, Patrick Deneen. In essence, the American founders, and especially Madison, are seen as following in the footsteps of Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke in their abandonment of the political task of civic education and character formation. And that's key, that you rely on institutions. Diamond said that that the substitute the Americans made was to put in the place of character formation shrewd institutional arrangements that would do the job, in essence, of allowing people to remain devils where you could still have the rule of law and decent government. But this isn't the only interpretation. There are others who disagree with this. and think that Madison and the founders, and probably most of the founders, I wouldn't say all of them, because remember Hamilton said something about, we don't live in the land of Hottentots and Laplanders anymore. So this searching for virtue might not be quite the thing Americans are about. On the other hand, he was one of the people who most exhibited probably the greatest amount of self-control and virtue among the American founders. Well, as Madison said in the Federalist, there's a degree of depravity in human nature, which makes government necessary. But there's also the potential for virtue, which makes good government possible. In fact, what the founders called the quote, great experiment in self-government is the test of whether men are capable of establishing and maintaining good government. And this depends on the character of the citizens and the ethos of the political community. Or in other words, it depends on civic virtue. Republican virtue, I think, is essentially the same thing as Republican self-government. It's the ability of the people to rule themselves justly, which further depends on the capacity of the citizen to rule his own soul. To quote a great American author on the subject, they who cannot govern themselves cannot govern others. So is Republican virtue needed for the stability and health of the polity? If there's no virtue among the people, Madison argued at the ratifying convention in Virginia, then we're in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks will be able to save us from ourselves. In essence, the idea of the rule of law, the idea of the rule of law is that the rule of law is non-arbitrary, but it is not autonomous. There's always a human force behind the laws, who are the actual rulers of the regime. And the beliefs, the opinions, and the mores of these men and women matter tremendously. In a word, as William B. Allen has once put it tersely, and I've never heard it put better, you cannot have a republic without Republican citizens. Now, if this is the case, what, if anything, can be done to restore Republican virtue in our age? The easy question of today, right? Without attempting to answer this question, which I'm not capable of doing sufficiently anyway, let me offer one crucial consideration that bears upon the matter. If self-government is the core of Republican virtue, and given that self-government is essentially the ability to control one's passions and rule one's own soul in accordance with our nature, then what are the odds of restoring the ethos of self-government in a time in which the dominant opinion in the regime vehemently rejects the very idea of human nature and is all about constructing one's own identity, intersectionality, transhumanity, and in general, creating one's own meaning of the universe? And even if there is still a swath of sanity in middle America that has not jumped on this bandwagon of human plasticity, how long will it be before it is too long that we will be drowned in the wake of the dominant opinion now being touted by academics, the media, big tech industries, and governmental leaders? Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Colleen. And our last speaker today is Stephen Smith. He's a professor of political science and philosophy at Yale. Yesterday, actually, saw the publication of his latest book titled Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes from Yale University Press. And his other books include Modernity and its Discontents. Stephen?
Thank you, Adam, and George, and everybody. Those were such wonderful comments. I'm just tempted to just save my time and we'll move forward, because what have you left me with? But nevertheless, I have a few comments I could make. Civic virtue, or Republican virtue, as we call it. What is that? It's an old-fashioned term, to be sure. We don't often hear it, or it's not a common term in our public discourse, especially from politicians. When we use it, as I think Colleen mentioned, it seems to hearken back in some way to ancient Greece and Rome, the models of Lycurgus, the Spartan founder, Brutus and Cato and the Roman Republic, actors who exemplified a certain kind of self-sacrificing and self-denying heroism. That is not exactly what we in the modern world think of when we think of civic virtue, although occasionally, and we are called upon, I think especially in times of war, for people to exercise those kinds of qualities. Let me do a moment of history, like Colleen. The language of Republican virtue in particular entered the English language world in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was initially associated with writers like James Harrington and Algernon Sidney. Love that name, Algernon. It was associated with the Glorious Revolution and the Whig settlement that ended it, and the kind of virtue that these Whig writers of that period, the late 17th, early 18th century, described, or the word they used to describe that kind of civic virtue was patriotism. Also, a fairly new word in the English-speaking lexicon. One of the things I discovered in my doing the research for my book is that the word patriotism, patriot or patriotism, is not used in the entire collected work of William Shakespeare, who had a wider vocabulary than any other English writer at the time. It is a much newer word. Patriotism was a term that, again, grew out of the settlement, the Whig settlement, and it was connected with ideas of constitutional government, of the balance of powers, and the protection of certain kinds of rights or civil liberties. And it was in that form that the term virtue or patriotism came to be transplanted to the New World, particularly in the generation prior to the American Revolution. That story, of course, has been brilliantly told most famously perhaps by Gordon Wood, but of course many others who talked about the way in which this Whig political language of the common good and the public good and patriotism and so on came into the American context. To be a patriot in the American context meant to be a Republican, to advance or to support a republic. The opponents of the patriots were of course, the Tories, the loyalists who wanted to stay with England. And to be a Republican in America, early America, meant not simply to support a mixed or balanced constitution of the older English model, but to be in favor of equality, where equality meant the absence of hereditary monarchs and aristocracies and traditional landed aristocrats, and of course, a regime open to rights. These ideas, equality, the absence of hereditary aristocracy, and openness to rights became the basis of what over time began to be thought of as the American creed. Not a formal doctrine, not enunciated specifically in any particular text or doctrine, but a widely subscribed set of values and beliefs that more or less framed the idea of what it meant to be an American. And our debates about what it meant to be an American largely took place within the horizon of these conceptions, this broad conception of American patriotism. But today, I want to argue, and this comes out in my book, that American creed, that older conception of what we might call creedal patriotism or something like that, is under attack from two extremes that have, each of which has become an extremely powerful force within our society. From the one extreme, generally associated with the left, We have the tendency that you see particularly in educated circles towards a kind of cosmopolitanism, that, we are citizens of the world. We owe no particular allegiance to this country or that country, but we owe our allegiances to a kind of globalized humanity. Oddly, this is also connected to the current ideology of multiculturalism, which sees our identities shaped by ethnicity and race and other, I would call them kind of sub-political, pre-political forces that, again, push against this idea of a kind of national American identity. That on the left. From the right, patriotism finds itself challenged by the recent uptick or upsurge of nationalism. Now, nationalism and patriotism are often identified with one another. And in many respects, they sort of derive from a common root, but a desire to be respected, to have your way of life validated and strong. There's a natural and laudable in many ways disposition for that, but they move in different directions. Nationalism becomes a kind of fierce and angry and insular particularism. It feeds on envy, on resentment. It relies upon the identification of both foreign and domestic others who pose a kind of existential challenge or threat to our identity. Patriotism speaks a different language. It grows out of a sense of loyalty and pride in one's traditions, in one's way of life, in one's country, in one's constitution. But it is not an example, or it is not an instance of my country right or wrong. Patriotism includes elements of humility, kind of getting back to an issue that Jonathan raised. I might, a sense of moderation and humility. It also is capable of shame and self-correction when our country goes wrong, when we feel our country goes wrong, and where we feel there is room for improvement. For example, the recent, or not so recent actually, recognition of Congressional Medal of Honor winners who were denied the medal because of their race and have now been acknowledged. And this is a kind of self-correction. So patriotism, I want to argue, has a self-corrective mechanism within it. And that is important. It's not simply a question of unthinking or unwavering support of what exists. There is an element of rational and self-critical reflection that goes with the patriotic disposition. I'll just mention, in wrapping up, three things or three features that I think of as crucial to the experience of American patriotism or American civic virtue. I'm using those terms more or less synonymously, although there's more involved than that. The first is our sense of civic virtue or patriotism is rooted in a belief in equality that goes back to the Equality Clause of the Declaration of Independence, that every human being, that everyone has a dignity that needs to be that deserves to be respected. And that sense of equality, moral equality, I think is central to what it is to be an American. The second feature of our idea of civic virtue is that it is aspirational. It doesn't simply rest, it is not simply complacent or rest content with what we are. It is deeply aware that there is often and almost always a discrepancy between what we are and what we aspire to be. There is an aspirational character to that. Samuel Huntington, the famous political scientist Samuel Huntington, spoke about America as not only a creedal nation, as he called it, but we are a country with frequent moments of what he called creedal passions, where the discrepancy between what we are and what we aspire to be come into conflict and create moments of agitation and conflict. And the third feature of civic virtue that, as I understand it, and to some degree also helps to distinguish it from this ancient sense of virtue as kind of purely, in a way, self-abnegating, is that our sense of patriotism is based upon a love of freedom. That virtue is not simply subordinating ourselves to the common good, although we require, an attention to the common good, but we also celebrate our achievements, both public and private, both in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere, in all kinds of ways, in business, in the arts, in academia, in a variety, in science, in technology. These are all ways of expressing freedom. They're all manifestations of freedom and are inseparable from our conception of a civic virtue and an American patriotism. Do all of these things fit together in a perfectly harmonious, rational whole? No, there are tensions between them, but that is what it is to live and, to be a human being, to experience these tensions and to be able to find ways of adjusting between them, compromising between them, moderating them in some ways, but they are all central elements. There are others too, but to be sure, but they are all central elements of what I understand to be American public or civic virtue.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everybody, for those opening remarks. You've definitely given us a lot to consider and cover. I have a few questions of my own. And again, audience members can submit questions either on Twitter at #AEIVirtue or by email at nicole.penn@AEI. But before I jump in with my own questions, I would like to give our speakers just a chance, if they'd like, to maybe react to or elaborate any of the points that I've made so far. And then I'll have a few questions. Maybe for this, since they went last, we'll start with Colleen and Stephen, if either of you would like to jump in with anything, and then we'll turn to John and George. Colleen?
Thanks, Adam. I guess what I have is primarily a question based on what George and John were saying, that if I understood you correctly, that we're not at a place of the utmost seriousness in terms of a crisis in America today, that civility and forbearance and truthfulness, if we let them do their work, we can move forward, that we're not at Flight 93. This is not it. And I guess my question is what is the nature of this disagreement that's going on in the country? And I don't see it as, I see it as fundamental. It's about what it means to be human and how we should live our lives. And if it is that fundamental, then I think it's going to take something more than civility, as important as that is. And that's certainly the first thing that we need to do. We need to talk. We need to stop canceling out each other. And we need to talk about these things, because we have no chance at all of working this out if we don't talk, and we don't talk in a civil manner. But isn't there a crisis that we're facing that's of such large proportions that it's going to take more than good manners?
George, Jonathan, do either of you want to respond to that right away?
I'd be happy to, though I don't want to jump ahead of George.
No, please go ahead.
I think yes to crisis, especially the epistemic crisis. I'm terribly worried about the fact that a large majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen. It was not, but that's going to poison our political discourse. I'm worried about the informational weapons that have been unleashed over the past little while. I'm worried about the polarization without forbearance is a critical problem for democracy. And we're seeing that now too. It's showing up in the polls. People now think the other party is not just in disagreement with them, but a positive threat to the country. So yeah, I would accept the term crisis. I just would say, I don't think this is the last crisis. I think it's one of a long series in America. And when we play our cards right, I wouldn't suggest to be complacent or mindlessly optimistic. Slavery, fundamental definitional questions about what a human being is and what justice is, or about the role of women, or one that affected me in my lifetime very directly, the role of homosexuals. People like me were considered an existential threat to the national security. It was thought that we would bring toleration of us would bring God's wrath down on the entire country. We were supposedly seducing children, breaking up families. A lot of people believe that, and a lot of people believe that people like me who wanted to favor gay equality and gay marriage were basically going to end the whole game. I think that over time, as I say, if we play our cards right, we get something more like a dialectic. We work these things out in time in a way that helps us to advance. That's what I hope will come out of this. But the reason I'm so glad that you're all here on this panel is nothing is assured, and none of those processes work without that foundational layer of Republican virtue, and we can't take that for granted. Is that responsive?
Yes, I think so, George.
I'll be really quick on this because I think I agree with much of what John just said. But the first part I would highlight, I think I'm in real agreement with Colleen, and just in terms of the institutions aren't enough. I don't think the reading is quite as dependent upon self-government with citizens as I think maybe Colleen does. I think what's crucial in the American scheme is you still have representation and you have representatives, but that's still, you still depend upon a citizenry that does, practice certain habits. And I don't think that these are merely, as Jonathan was saying, being polite, Colleen. I do think that there is a serious crisis. I guess I don't know that the crisis is what you diagnose. I mean, I think that there are some fundamental disagreements about how to live. But when I look back over the last decade or so, my worry is that the stakes are always being made too high. I mean, the Flight 93 election meme itself is just sort of preposterous on its face, right? And yet you raise the stakes to this is an existential threat to democracy, and the author keeps going, and yet you can't really even identify what's the existential threat to democracy. Why is this, the election of Hillary Clinton, going to end the American regime and the American way of life? And so in that sense, I mean, I do think the stakes have often been up far too much. And where I have found a lot of common ground is I think both the center left and the center right take the threat to democracy that Jonathan identifies is, that suddenly we actually not only treat our those we disagree with as enemies, not just fellow citizens whom we disagree with, but the level of not disinformation, but just outright lies that exist and are being cultivated by a certain class of leaders. I find those to be the real threats to the future of America's democratic experiment right now. And then the question is, okay, so what can you do about those things? I think that's a much harder question to address. So I think I'm with you partly on the seriousness of the threat, but I guess I don't totally understand the diagnosis.
We'll get back to what can be done or what should be done in a little bit. Steve, would you like to weigh in on this question at all, or do you have anything else you'd like to react to that's been said so far?
I think it was a great question, and listening to all three of them, Jonathan, George, and Colleen, it's hard for me to find exactly where I disagree with any of them. But let me pick up a point that Colleen made, that was sort of alluded to in some of the responses, because I do think the issue we're facing, the set of issues we're facing today, the divisions, the us against them. I mean, we live, to use a term from an infamous German political philosopher, we live in a kind of Schmittian moment after the name of Carl Schmitt, where the world, our national politics is divided up between friend and enemy, the Flight 93 model that Jonathan referenced. It's a very bad model for any kind of civic engagement and civic republicanism, and how to overcome that. I mean, I do agree with Colleen's point. It's going to require more than talk. although that might be a start. I mean, I am a teacher. I believe in talk. I believe in education. And democracies are regimes of talk for the most part. But it does require more than talk. And I think one of the difficulties is we live in a vast country of over 300 million people, a kind of country that the founders could not even have imagined, not only in scope and size, but in complexity and in variety, diversity. The fact is we don't know each other. Who are they? Who are we? We don't know each other. I'm reminded of a scene from Steven Spielberg's great film, Lincoln, when Lincoln is having a talk with Mrs. Keckley, the African-American servant or helper to Mary Todd Lincoln. And she says to him, I mean, this is wholly fictional, I believe, but I thought it captured something very nicely. She said, what do you think will happen? Lincoln says to her, rather honestly, I don't know you. I don't feel I know you, but we'll work something out. We will find a way to work this out. And I feel that this sort of describes ourselves today. We don't know each other. We live in silos. We live not only geographically separate, but in kind of cultural and educational silos. We don't know each other. And civic virtue, however you want to describe it, public virtue, civic virtue, patriotism, it does require a common language, a kind of common experience for how it is that on which we can base any kind of civil conversation. One of the things I propose in my book for this, and don't spend a great deal of time with it, but I've come to believe to be very important, is that we need some kind of common public service for young people to have something that they share in common. That could mean many different things. It doesn't necessarily have to mean military service, but it could mean teaching in a school. It could mean working in an underserved community, working in any number of things. But some kind of service that puts people from very different backgrounds in touch with each other. So they realize that people who come from a different country, have a different skin, have a different sexual orientation, are not existential enemies to one another, but people from whom they might actually learn something. And that may sound naive and optimistic, but I think it's one of the few ways, if we're going to kind of move beyond this moment, it's one way, not the only way, but one way in which we might think about where to go.
Let me take that point and maybe redirect it in a question. I mean, it would seem to me that relative to the time of our nation's founding, we as an American people are much more thoroughly integrated with one another and familiar with one another, right? Technology has brought us closer together through transportation and communications. We're a national market, we're a national media community. We're also at the local level, we're more integrated racially and among ethnicities and so on. In so many ways, it might seem that actually the passage of time has created better circumstances for seeing one another, even in the national community, as part of a real national community. But maybe in some respects, the familiarity has bred contempt, because what I'm hearing is that the more we see each other and the more we interact with each other, the less we are capable of the sorts of qualities of character that we're talking about. Steve, maybe I'll begin with you on that, since you raised the point, and then give others a chance to weigh in.
That's an important challenge, and there is an obvious truth to that. I mean, through television and other things, we do seem to think we know more about each other. But what we often get, of course, from television are just caricatures of what other Americans are like. You don't go inside their lives. You don't see, their anxieties, their uncertainties, their families, and so on. So I agree. We do through science and technology and education have created a greater sort of what seems to be a greater landscape of familiarity in some ways. But I wonder how deep it goes. Does it, I mean, seeing a television sitcom about friends sitting around a coffee shop in, you know, Boston, how much does that really get into? You know, it's fun to watch, or Seinfeld, or I'm dating myself a little bit, but I do think just the experience is lacking. But so I agree, but I still am not totally convinced by that.
Well, I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this too, or maybe broadening the question a bit. What is it about the most recent years or more that have caused problems?
I'm jumping out of the gates to take a crack at that one, because I think the answer comes from a man at American Enterprise Institute called Yuval Levin. So sociologists distinguish between two very different kinds of behavior. One is communication, which we can do with others, and another is display. And display is when you posture in order to promote your own social status, often to the expense of someone else. These public forums allow us to see each other, but what they're really doing in many cases, allowing us to display, to perform. We are acting performatively. As Yuval points out, if you want civic virtue, if you want people to really relate to each other in constructive ways, you need to do it mediated through institutions like families and workplaces and scouts and unions, and you know how long the list is. Those are places where people not just see each other to display, but they can join forces toward a constructive mission and forge a common identity. Even as we have seen platforms expand in a way we've never seen before, we've seen the weakening of institutions in a way we've never understood before. And that, I think, Adam, explains the paradox to which you refer.
George?
I think that's really well said.
Go ahead, Colleen. Go on, Colleen.
I'm sorry.
Please go ahead,
I think that's really well said. To the institutions that have been so severely weakened, and without which we're not building a process of deliberation and building a common opinion together. Our federalism on the one hand, and then the Congress on the other hand. If Congress isn't doing its job legislating, then it's not taking the opinion of the people seriously, which is supposed to work through that institution to refine and enlarge the public views. And this whole idea of civic association, or in its best sense, it would be something like a kind of civic friendship. I think it can be over a larger territory, not just, in the small polis, because it has to do with not knowing everybody personally, but it has to do with knowing something about and caring something about the character of your fellow citizens. And because in the end, it's not just our relationships with each other, whether we like or dislike each other. It's whether we have something in common, that we love something in common, that creates a bond that makes us fellow citizens. And it's only through that kind of discourse and needing the tools of self-government, as Tocqueville would talk about, and all the layers building up through these institutions, that's possible in a country of this size. So that's critical, I think, what you said, John, and that's some of the work that so badly needs to be done.
Thanks, Colleen. George?
I'll add to that just quickly on the institutional front. The one area where we could have a lot of hope for reform, if we could get the reforms, is with political parties. I mean, if you look at the kind of division I think you're pointing to, that's certainly true, but it really exists in, as John was saying, in this kind of performative world. When you actually look at the center, there continue to be really enormous areas of agreement in American life. But right now, political parties aren't structured to put us there. And the quality of our representation has gone down because of that as well. I mean, so I think those are kind of some of the institutional reforms that we could think about that would complement some of the civic virtues we'd like to cultivate. And I would really second Congress, and I'm even going to take a moment here to plug AEI Salvatori collaboration, because we have done 2 sessions like this on Congress, thinking about how do you restore Congress to its proper institutional place in the constitutional scheme for all the reasons that have been said. And I believe, and Nicole could confirm this maybe after, we have a 3rd one coming up on March 24th. So we've been focusing on Congress for just these reasons.
And maybe after the third one, we'll have solved the problem. This is great. But let's look back into let's look back into history for maybe some lessons. Obviously, and as many have said already, this is not the first moment in which there are concerns that this part of our capacity for self-government has fallen away. We've seen it in the Civil War. We saw it in 1800, in elections of 1800. Is there a particular moment in history we can point to, either as maybe the best America's ever seen it in terms of inculcating the values we're talking about here, or maybe a moment where things really fell apart, but it was brought together, maybe a historical lesson?
It's hard to answer that in the abstract, because I think you need to look at particular institutions at particular times. I have to second what Colleen said. It's just so important. I think if you could name one institution that both depends on civic virtue and needs to model civic virtue, it would be Congress. And when I came to Washington, Congress functioned quite well. It didn't function beautifully, but it functioned well. From about 1963 to about 1993, it did a pretty darn good job, and in a pretty darn inclusive way. In Congress, I would say that the beginning of the decline starts probably with the ascension of Newt Gingrich in 1994, and then rapidly accelerates to the point where today members of Congress, new members, young members, are hiring communication staff instead of legislative staff, which tells you that they're not seeing their job anymore as legislating. They're seeing it as performing. You could go through the list, I think, of other institutions and other dates and come up with a bunch of different things.
Anyone? Stephen?
The other place, Adam, where it's really lacking is in our educational system. You know, we're all, at least some of us are part of this, and we have to take responsibility for the universities not teaching the teachers the accurate history and principles of the nation. You know, I've just taken a new post at Arizona State University, which in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which is dedicated precisely to doing this, because this is one of the largest universities in the country. And the legislature in Arizona said, you know, we need to be doing this in this state and in this nation. And so we're hoping here at Arizona that other states will pick up this model and, you know, dedicate, make sure that in their schools, civic education is being attended to. But this is going to get tricky because there's a real controversy today, right? Over civic education as content and civic education as action. So.
Stephen?
Let me suggest a specific historical moment that would be a positive antithesis to the loathsomeness of the attack on the integrity and so on of the 2020 election. In the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln was completely convinced that he would be a one-term president. The war was not going as well as he wanted. The Battle of Gettysburg, which he had hoped might be a decisive breakthrough, turned out not to be. In August of that year, it will be my responsibility to work with the incoming president, who he knew would be one who would accept slavery and would oppose everything that Lincoln had stood for. And yet he said, although there were many, or at least some within his own party, urging him to suspend elections. I mean, it was in a civil war, an unprecedented moment, they should possibly suspend elections. Lincoln said no, even though he expected he might lose, and that he was willing to gamble the future of not only the Civil War, but of freedom in America and emancipation. He was willing to gamble on an election and let the chips fall where they may. Fortunately, things turned around for him in the autumn of that year, and he won in a landslide. But to me, that is such a telling moment to the sort of the language of Flight 93. Like, you know, with George, like, why? What is the existential threat that was posed in 2016? In what way could it even be remotely comparable to the situation Lincoln faced in 1864? And yet Lincoln thought that a war that would suspend elections would not have been a war worth fighting for. And that to me was an act of sublime heroism and sort of civic virtue of a kind that I'm not sure has an equal in the American experience, but should stand as a kind of standing refutation, I would say, to the attitudes and lies that were spread in the most recent and even in the previous 2016 election.
George, when you look back to history, thinking about these things, what moments do you focus on?
Not the one in particular that I would, maybe give us good reason for hope right now, because in some ways it looks worse, is the election of 1800. I mean, the divisions were probably actually deeper than our own. If you're disheartened with our current media and fake news, go back and look at the media from that period of time. Where lies were actually quite common in the media. Political opponents were treated as enemies. The Adams administration was actually, actively engaged. And Adams is in interesting ways that may be close parallel in some ways, and others obviously not, to the last occupant of the White House temperamentally. I mean, they used the political power of the state to punish political opponents. And you had an election that was uncertain, and it was dragged out and then ultimately decided by the House of Representatives. And in that period, things looked precarious. And this is maybe where I don't want to downplay the seriousness of what we face, but I also think real small achievements on the legislative front could really do a lot to kind of bring Americans back to the center in ways. And you ended up with Jefferson having a very successful first presidency. I mean, to where he actually won a smashing victory in 1804. And so, I mean, if you look in 1800, in December and then February of 1801, things look awful. A year or so later, things actually look very good. So, and some of it comes actually, I think, from the success of the Jefferson administration. I don't think it's exact at all, but I mean, it's reason to be hopeful if we're looking for that.
In our audience, John Soliday asks whether there's an inherent tension between being a free trade commercial republic and social cohesion. And maybe I'll expand the question a little bit and ask, is there a necessary relationship between the issues we're talking about and markets, also religion, and also technology? Are any of these three forces either, do they fundamentally and inherently shape the issues we're talking about, or is there a way to sort of mute or amplify the effects as we want them to? Jonathan?
I was hoping you'd pass that one to someone with a PhD. That is such a big and important question. It's been argued since before the American Republic that liberalism, as we call it today, these open-ended neutral systems of social negotiation tend to undermine over time civic virtue, because they emphasize personal freedom and they don't hold people accountable and they don't impose moral structures that hold up over time. And you could certainly argue, and many have, I think someone mentioned Patrick Deneen earlier, for example, that capitalism and science and technology and so forth are undermining civic virtue and these foundations. I look at it differently. I agree that there's a tension there, but if you're a homosexual born in 1960 and grew up in a world where we were condemned from the pulpits, unable to work for the government, unable to serve in the military, unable to marry, persecuted by local governments, you couldn't call the police because then they would do the same thing to you, and so forth and so on. I see it a little differently. I see the history of liberalism as being this constant conversation, which in some cases undermines civic virtue, but in other ways can expand and strengthen it. I wouldn't trade this world for that world any day of the week. And I think there are a lot of other Americans who agree that in some ways this is a much more virtuous country, more civil, more decent, more understanding than it was when I was born. So I don't see it as a cut and dried issue. I see it as vectors that point in different directions. But I will yield to others. It's a very, very deep challenge to liberalism.
In addition to the factors of religion, technology, and markets, another question just came in while Jonathan was answering. Catherine Haley adds families to the mix of this. And so would any of the three PhDs on the panel like to speak to the influence of any of these considerations on Republican virtue? George?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's an obvious sort of tension between markets and not just potentially social cohesion, but politics more broadly. I mean, that's an uneasy relationship, but that doesn't mean it can't be an unproductive one in ways. And some of the interesting, I'm not one to generally do lots of more empirical political science of this sort, but interestingly, Robert Putnam's Making Democracy Work, which is actually a study of Italy, but then he applies it elsewhere, really shows that civic life and civic associations can really thrive, as John was saying, in a modern, more cosmopolitan, market-based economy. In fact, he goes so far as to say, not to say that it loses religion altogether, but civic associations can also thrive in the secular republic against at least certain forms of religion. And so, I mean, I think the tensions are obviously there, and we need to, think about how to negotiate those. It's interesting because then Putnam also has interesting things to say about family life. And I'll just be really quick on this point, but I think it's a really interesting question because I think it speaks to, one of the issues that really is confronting America in terms of the kinds of inequality that we're facing, because the evidence is that in economic inequality can be problematic enough, but what's really happening is economic inequality is spilling over into civic life, as Putnam and other authors have demonstrated, and it's leading to a kind of civic inequality. Excuse me, and that's where families become so important. So as Colleen mentioned, as civic education, say, gets taught less in secondary schools and less in colleges and universities, really the slack gets completely picked up by families, by and large. So that the well-off and the well-educated tend to transmit this knowledge on to their children. And so you have, a kind of not just a robust sense of civic life, but a robust sense of civic engagement that's largely being put forward by families and families, of a certain sort. That's good that that's being carried forward in those areas, but really bad for the country as a whole is it also then indicates, a widening gap, often really even called a civic gap between the well-off and the less well-off. And so I think families are a really important feature of that.
Colleen?
Yeah, I would agree with that and only add that the more government stays out of things, the more room there is for voluntary associations, including the family, churches, and so on. So I think the free market can be very compatible with a robust understanding of civic virtue, as long as we think of markets as ultimately having a foundation, a moral foundation in the conditions of freedom. There are certain things, lines that we can't cross in terms of markets. For example, trading in human flesh. I mean, there are just some things that have to be foundations to the market for the market to be compatible with civic virtue. If I could just say one word about Flight 93, because it's gotten such a bad rap today, Michael Anton's article. I understood Michael Anton in that article to be arguing a sort of, and this goes back to the question of, was there a period in history that's reminiscent that we could maybe learn a lesson from? And I'm thinking of the 1850s and Lincoln's speech, "Whither are we tending?" And Lincoln talked about conspiracies. He didn't say everybody met in one room. Franklin, James, Roger, and Stephen, they didn't all meet in one room and conspire. But there was a tendency of what was happening that was going in a certain direction that was not just chipping away, but destroying the foundations of what America stood for. And that's what I took the Flight 93 article to mean, that it's time to wake up before it's too late.
Stephen, any thoughts on the question of religion, technology, families, markets?
Let me just say, I want to say a word about markets, because I thought that was a useful point, because it's often thought of in some ways that market society, a commercial society, deflates the possibilities of civic virtue, of people acting in ways other than out of self-interest and out of utility or out of other motives. My book, in many ways, well, it makes a defense at the end of market society and of commercial society. But I do think there is a variation of market society that has become increasingly problematic over time. And that is a kind of, I guess maybe it can be called in some ways market fundamentalism, in some quarters neoliberalism, in other quarters a kind of libertarianism, which begins with a kind of, in many ways, again, admirable desire not to be interfered with, to be allowed to be on your own and to work without being interfered with, but can easily morph, as I think it has in many ways in our public life, into a kind of belief that nobody can tell me what to do. It becomes a kind of recipe for ungovernability. Nobody has a right to tell me what to do, to wear a mask, to do anything I don't want to do. And that kind of stubborn refusal to consider other people. I mean, the conditions of civility, that we are individuals, to be sure, but we live with other people and we have responsibilities and obligations to them and to society. I mean, there's this danger. I do think that represents a challenge an educational challenge to the future of any kind of civic value or patriotic virtue in a commercial world. We are becoming, in a way, kind of ungovernable, and I think that's a very, very serious problem.
We only have about 3 minutes left, and so I'll make 2 quick observations and then one last sort of lightning round question. These are my 2 observations. One is I've given some thought to these issues myself and written a little bit about it. I often find myself thinking about these issues in terms of us versus them, those of us who are fighting for a resurgence of Republican virtue versus those who are making things so terrible. And I guess I probably should concede the irony of turning Republican virtue debates into an us versus them debate. My second observation is I often wonder whether the things that we've discussed for reform, should we focus on the ground up or from the top down? Is this something where we need to begin at a local level, at a community and family level, and hope that our leaders turn around? Or is it something that's going to require statesmanship from the very beginning in order to help bring about reforms from the bottom up? So those are just 2 observations. My last question is this, and it comes from Daniel Stitt of the Hewlett Foundation. He asks, we've spoken in generalities throughout all of this. Can you very quickly offer one concrete reform that you would most like to see to help begin this process of renewal of civic virtue? We'll start with Stephen.
Well, I have suggested an idea. I mean, I don't know how concrete it is or how practical it is at our moment, but I do think a plan for some kind of public service for young people, maybe after college or even maybe after I think after college age would be good, sort of before people enter the workplace, before people are going to sort of become full adults in a certain sense. I think spending a year or 2 in public service would be a good thing. I've been very struck by this in many visits I've had to Israel, and the way in which through common military service, not everybody serves in the military, they do all kinds of things. It provides a kind of common basis for, despite all of their disagreements, and they're in many ways as massive as ours, nevertheless, it provides a kind of common basis and common experience for every Israeli. And I think something like that in America would be very needful.
Thanks. Jonathan?
The framing of the question is a little wrong, because I think, Adam, the answer to your second observation, does this start from the top down or does it start from the bottom up, is yes. It's very easy to see the forest fire. Seeing the regrowth is slower and often hard to see, but there's a lot happening out there in the grassroots. And there's some good signs even at the top. I think we saw that, for example, in Mitch McConnell stepping forward. It took him too long, but he stepped forward. I think others will. So I'm going to name one thing, but not because it's the one thing, but because it's a one thing that everyone on this call and everyone who's listening can do, which is go and take a look at braverangels.org. This is a national grassroots depolarization movement. I used to be on the board. I'm still a fan. These are people organizing in local communities to join together across political divides, not to persuade each other, not even to find common ground, but simply to restore civility and communication and relearn to talk to each other, see each other as human beings, and rejoin that human connection. And it's really working, and it's taking off like wildfire. And to me, it shows public appetite in America to take matters into our own hands, not to be driven by social media and inflammatory politicians. And to me, that's a very hopeful sign. So check it out.
Thanks, Jonathan. Colleen?
Well, in response to Daniel Stidd's question, I was recently worked with Mike McConnell, Robbie George, and Ilan Werman for the National Constitution Center in a thought experiment, not meant to be real proposals, but one of the things that we put in our Constitution was that Congress, when in session, that members of Congress have to be present on the floor of the House during debates. It means they actually have to listen to each other. And even if they're multitasking, what happens is with 1 ear you are listening, especially if someone has something genuinely interesting to say that they've thought about. People stop in sessions like that and pay attention, and deliberation can start taking place, and Congress could start doing their job again. It'll happen much more naturally if people are actually on the floor of the House doing their job as legislators during sessions of Congress.
Thanks, Colleen. And George, you get the last word.
I'll be really quick on that. I would really second Colleen's suggestion, but just in terms of trying to engage both John's thoughts on civility and forbearance, I've started telling my students and making my students say that you have to pick a regular columnist or two that you really disagree with intensely. If you're a conservative student, you should, read Will Soliton frequently and often. If you're a liberal student, you should be reading David French or Jonah Goldberg or someone like that, and regularly do it and listen and really engage their ideas. That's a very small thing, but I think that, that can begin to break down the silos we tend to put around ourselves.
Thanks, George, and thanks, everybody. Before we go, just a couple of announcements. First, in light of our joint commitment to facts and truth, I do need to correct a small little hiccup along the way. Our next event with the Salvatori Center on Congress's Power of the Purse is March 25th. So March 25th, I hope people will join us then. AEI's next public event is actually tomorrow, February 25th. It's on the role of families in human flourishing, a conversation with James Heckman. So I hope folks will just again. But once again, I want to thank the Salvatori Center and all four of our speakers, Stephen Smith, Colleen Sheehan, George Ness, and Jonathan Rausch for their remarks today. And thanks everybody for joining us. Please join us again soon.